Hello, everybody. Welcome. I'm Patty Walter. I teach here at Medill. I do the undergraduate health and science writing class. I teach a class in the graduate school for STEM PhDs learning writing, and I also go in and out of the MSJ science writing program. So thrilled to have you all here today for the AAAS and Kavli Science Journalism Award Lecture. I want to start by acknowledging those two organizations. The Kavli Foundation advances science for the benefit of humanity, funds research institutes in astrophysics, nanoscience, neuroscience, and theoretical physics, supports conferences, symposia, endowed professorships, workshops, and other activities, and is a founding partner of the Kavli Prizes in those areas. The American Association for the Advancement of Science, AAAS, is the world's largest general scientific organization. If you're a student here, at some point you will hear us say AAAS this, AAAS that. They have amazing journalism fellowships for scientists who want to learn journalism, as well as journalists who want to learn science. The AAAS Kavli Science Journalism Award Program was established in 1945, endowed by Kavli Foundation. It went global in 2015, and they give cash prizes to amazing journalism year after year and sponsor these speakerships around the country. So we're thrilled to be one of the recipients this year. So our speaker today, I'm thrilled to welcome, is Hillary Rosner. She is a journalist who specializes in magazine-style stories about science and the environment. She's covered environmental issues for National Geographic, the New York Times, Wired, Men's Journal, Scientific American, Mother Jones, Popular Science, Discover, High Country News, the Boston Globe, the Denver Post, Ottoman, Smithsonian, Slate. I can go on, but you get the idea. She's one of those big journalists out there who really knows how her environmental street cred. I particularly like this description. She writes about these strange and disturbing ways that human activity is altering our planet, as well as the innovative strategies we're devising to understand, adapt to, and counteract those changes. Her reporting has taken her around the world: Indonesia, Ethiopia, Nicaragua, and even deep within her home here in the American West. She lives in Boulder, and we were just talking about, and she's like, oh, back when I was reporting in Rocky Mountain National Park, and I thought, oh, how many of us wish that that was our backyard where we could just tap out the door and do a little more reporting. So she's received many, many honors. This is her second AAAS Kavli Science Journalism Award. She's currently a TED Scripps Fellow at the University of Colorado Center for Environmental Journalism. She spent 2012 as an Alicia Patterson Fellow, which is another one of those great fellowships for environmental journalists, and she was a 2010-11 Knight Science Journalism Fellow at MIT. She's a contributing editor at the website Biographic and frequent speaker at workshops and seminars on science communication. She has a Master of Science in Environmental Studies from the University of Colorado and an MFA in Creative Writing from New York University. She spent the early part of her career in New York City, where she worked for the New York Post, the Village Voice, and New York Magazine, and I'm sure you can ask her later how she made that transition to Boulder. But for now, I'd like to welcome Hillary Rosner.
Okay, is this on? Can you hear me? It's on, but it's not turned up. Does that work?
Is the mic
Is it too
on?
far away? It's on. It's just like too far away
They
from
can
my.
hear you in the board. You're
Okay, cool. I'm good. Thank you so much, Patty, and thanks to all of you for coming. I'm going to put this higher up. Is that better?
More comfortable with the handheld? Yeah, let's just use that.
I'm having all kinds of technological problems today.
Turn it off. I'm a jinx this quarter. Ask my students. Okay, there you go.
Sorry, there have been quite a few technological glitches, most of them my fault, so I apologize. Thank you so much, Patty. It's an honor to be here. Thanks for having me, and thanks especially to Earl Lane and AAAS for making this possible. I just want to say I made some slides using Google Slides, and it was my first time using it, and we couldn't figure out, even between all the technological prowess here, we couldn't figure out how to get it to play correctly. So I've downloaded my slides to PowerPoint. And hopefully things won't look funky, but also you're just gonna have to bear with me because the notes that I wrote look totally different than they did when I first made them. So I'm gonna apologize ahead of time if I sort of stumble. So, as Patty said, I am a freelance science journalist, and I write mostly long-form narrative stories that try to explain and highlight the changes that are going on in the natural world. I did not, however, start out as a science journalist. In fact, I steered clear of science as much as possible throughout high school and even college. And when I became a journalist, I wrote about a lot of other things first. So this is a story I did in the New York Post. You can see I did some really hard-hitting coverage. Very, very important story. I worked as a general assignment reporter and a features writer at the New York Post. And as Patty mentioned, I was an editor at the Village Voice, and I wrote features for New York Magazine. But while I was doing all these jobs, I found myself increasingly drawn to environmental stories. And I distinctly remember sitting at my desk at the Village Voice and poring over the course catalog for the Yale School of Forestry and just trying to imagine what it would be like to sit in and take these classes. And I also briefly worked at a startup website in New York City called Inside.com, which covered the media industry. And I also distinctly remember sitting at my desk at Inside magazine and thinking, why am I working at Inside when I want to be outside? So eventually I left New York City and moved to Boulder. And there I did a master's in environmental studies at the University of Colorado. And I gave myself the science background that I felt like I really needed to cover the environmental issues that I wanted to cover. So I kind of tried to remedy what I hadn't learned before. And armed with this new knowledge, I set about becoming a science journalist. But it turned out at the time, this was about a decade or so ago, and it turned out to not be so easy to get editors, most of whom were in New York City, on the top floor of skyscrapers, to see why they should care about environmental issues. And I remember pitching a story to an editor at New York Magazine, where I had worked before, so I kind of had a relationship there. And I pitched this story about some scientific research that was going on in Central Park that was looking at past climate, and it had to do with trying to predict future climate change in New York City. And this editor actually said to me, wow, this is really interesting, but we already did a climate change story this year. So I started doing what I thought of as Trojan horse stories. And these were articles that seemed to be about something else, but were really about environmental issues. So I thought of it kind of like making brownies with spinach in them. And I actually got some traction with this. So these are two. These are actually clips, the way they used to be done old school, where you would actually cut an article out of the newspaper and tape it down on some paper. These are two Trojan horse stories that ran in the New York Times House and Home section, where my editor seemed to have an affinity for like kooky Westerner stories. So I think he thought it was really quaint that people lived out west and had to deal with all these kind of weird, wacky Western things. So the first story is about drought, a pretty severe drought that was going on in the West back in, I think this was 2002 or 2003. And the other one is about wildfire mitigation. So it's about people increasingly moving into what's called the wildland-urban interface, kind of moving into the forests and having to deal with the problems of that. So they're both framed as lifestyle stories about how these wacky Westerners are coping with drought and with the threat of wildfire. But they ran in the House and Home section. So today, things are a little bit different, for better and for worse. There have been scores of popular books about the environment over the past decade. Some of them have won Pulitzer Prizes and other prestigious awards. There have been all kinds of wonderful documentaries on HBO, on Showtime, on Netflix about climate change and other environmental issues. There's no shortage of media coverage today about the environment, and more Americans are worried about the impacts of climate change. Yet I think it's safe to say that the natural world is actually more at risk today than it was when I started writing about this stuff. So these are just 3 headlines that I pulled from the news last week. The first was a study by the WWF, kind of speaks, I don't really need to say much about that. The second one was this terrible news from China. They actually reversed this 25-year ban on trafficking in rhino and tiger parts. So basically what this does is create a legal market for poaching endangered species. And the third headline is about the newly elected president of Brazil, who's sort of like in the Trump mold. And he has basically said that he holds the fate of the Amazon in his hands. And he has basically said that he wants to bulldoze it and turn it into cattle pasture and soybean fields. So the fact that things are worse means the stakes are higher than ever before, which means that covering this stuff is more important than it's ever been. And there was a great op-ed in the New York Times earlier this week, which I think everyone should read if you guys haven't seen it. It was a manifesto for working to limit global warming to less than 2 degrees C. And every day or every week it argued we need to do things to push against these, what they called the big forces that are restraining progress. So every day or every week you should learn about climate change. You should have an uncomfortable conversation with someone. You should call your representative. You should march in protest. You should run for office. And its main argument was that we need to turn this kind of work into a regular practice, something that becomes habit. Here's just one thing that they wrote in the story. So it says, historically, we've tackled the biggest challenge, that of meaning and the question of how to live a life, through the concept of practice, in the form of religion, cultural tradition, or disciplines like yoga or martial arts. Given the stark facts, this approach might be the most useful. Practice has value independent of outcome. It's a way of life, not a job with a clear payoff. A joyful habit, the right way to live. And I like to think about journalism as my practice. And I really encourage you all to think about it as yours, because we need more smart people covering this crisis and bearing witness to what's happening to our planet. But it's not always easy. There are no simple solutions to many of the problems that we face today. And environmental stories are rarely straightforward. In fact, if it seems like there's an easy solution, you're probably missing something. I was reminded of this often over the last couple of years as I was intermittently working on a story that will be out in National Geographic later this month. The story is about palm oil, which is the most widely used vegetable oil on the planet. And it is in so many processed foods. It's in cookies, candy, crackers, pizza dough, peanut butter. And it's also in so many things that we put on our skin. It's in makeup and lotion and shampoo and soap. And palm oil has played a huge role in the destruction of the rainforest and the decline of wildlife across Southeast Asia and now increasingly in Western Africa and South America. So this is a photograph that a friend of mine took a couple of years ago in central Kalimantan, an Indonesian Borneo. This is a rainforest being burned down to clear land for palm oil. And this is what it looks like afterwards. So this used to be a rainforest. And one of the species that's been most hurt by palm oil is the orangutan, which lives in the forests that are being destroyed. This is a photo I took about a year ago this time in Borneo. And basically, it's all palm oil to those mountains. You can literally drive for hours and not see another kind of tree. But palm oil is also an incredibly important part of the economy in some countries, including Malaysia and Indonesia, which are the biggest suppliers. And it's also a great crop in a lot of ways, including that you can grow far more of it per acre than any other oil crop. So if you tried to replace all the palm oil with like soybean oil or something, you would actually need a lot more land to grow it. So I wanted to answer the question, is there a way to do palm oil sustainably? So that when a friend or my mother-in-law says, hey, should I buy this product with palm oil in it, I can say yes or no. but it turns out it's not so simple. I traveled to Gabon in Central Africa and to Sabah, which is a Malaysian state on the island of Borneo. And I spoke to government officials and activists and conservation biologists and plantation workers, villagers, all kinds of people. So this in the center, that's actually what the fresh fruit bunches look like. Those little red things are the fruit that they turn into palm oil. This is me in Gabon with the head of the National Park Service there. These are some women in a Gabonese village where they're now growing palm oil, so it's impacting them. The guy on the top right is a smallholder farmer in Malaysia, so he actually grows palm oil on a few acres of land that he owns. And the woman on the bottom right is in Malaysia. She actually works for Nestle, which is doing a reforestation project there. They're trying to regrow the forest along this riverbank as a corridor for wildlife where trees were illegally cut down years ago. So all of these people are caught up in some way in the world of palm oil, and you can't really disentangle them from one another. These signs illustrate that tangled relationship even more starkly, and the fact that you can't often separate good from bad. I found these signs at a sanctuary for sun bears, which are these really cute little bears that live in Malaysia. So in Sabah, right in the middle of that sea of palm oil that I showed before, is this sun bear sanctuary. And this placard on the left explains how thousands of species are dependent on Borneo's forests and how they lose their forest homes when these jungles are cut down. And the sign on the right is basically telling you that this sun bear sanctuary is funded by the Sime Darby Foundation. And Sime Darby is one of the world's biggest palm oil companies. So they are responsible for the sun bears losing their homes to begin with. And you just can't really disentangle these things. We can't go back to a time before there was palm oil. So we have to try to encourage companies and governments to do the right thing. I interviewed the head of Sabah's forestry department, which is based right down the road from this. And he was this great conservationist who was actually trying to set aside tons of remaining forest land around the state. He actually ended up getting fired a couple of months ago, but he was telling me how important palm oil revenue was for conservation in Sabah. And I said to him, you know, you could argue that without palm oil, you wouldn't actually need that money for conservation. And he said, you could argue that, but you would be poor. By which he meant, this stuff has allowed many people in Malaysia to have a better quality of life. And again, there's no turning back. What I learned is that there are ways to make palm oil more sustainable, and a lot of people around the world are working to implement them. But it requires a huge effort from the corporations that grow palm oil and the corporations that buy it to use in their products, and from governments, and from consumers, not just here and in Europe, but in countries like China and India. You can't just say stop using palm oil because it's destroying the rainforest. And so what I concluded was the answer is not to boycott palm oil, but to make sure to only buy products containing palm oil that's sustainably grown. Because if concerned consumers boycotted all palm oil, those companies trying to do it right would fail, and what you'd be left with was the companies that really don't care and will do anything to make a profit. But again, that's not really an easy answer. And I actually think the fact that there was no easy answer makes the story that much more important to tell. So it was upsetting to learn that the forestry chief had been fired, not least because it happened while my story was in production and kind of caused some major problems for me. But also, I've learned writing environmental stories that without a champion, nothing gets done. So this is a story which actually won a AAAS Kavli award a while back. And it's a story about two champions of an endangered species of fish called the Razorback Sucker. Now, it can be really hard to make people care about a fish. You guys might have heard the term charismatic megafauna, but there's a reason why you hear a lot about polar bears, and they're kind of this emblem for climate change, right? They're furry, and they're cuddly, and they're charismatic. And this guy is kind of the opposite of that. But I tried to do it in this story through the protagonist. And so my main protagonist had been working for 30 years to try to save this one fish, which was worse off than when he had started. So here's what he said to me one day in the field. We were at Lake Mojave on the Arizona-Nevada border. Lake Mojave is a reservoir on the Colorado River. So he said, I've spent a 30-year career watching the animals I love and work on go down the toilet despite my best efforts. I love these fish. I want my children, my grandchildren, to have an opportunity to love these fish the way I do. They were a remarkable creation of Mother Nature. For us as a species, to allow these animals to be extinguished is fundamentally wrong. It's a philosophical thing. So the story of the Razorback Sucker is that it was once so abundant in the Colorado River that white settlers are said to have caught them with pitchforks and used them as livestock feed because there were so many of them. In the 1950s, we built the Davis Dam, which created Lake Mojave, and trapped some of these fish in the lake, but they still thrived there. But in the 1980s, scientists discovered that the razorback suckers living in the lake were actually the same fish that had been trapped there. So it wasn't like, offspring descendants of this population, but it was literally the same fish. So these fish lived for about half a century. So the fish that had been trapped there were spawning every year, but their hatchlings were being gobbled up by non-native fish that were living in the lake. And meanwhile, the adult fish that everybody thought, whoa, these guys are doing fine, they were inching closer to their half-century lifespan. And eventually, the population tanked. So they went from about 75,000 in the mid-1980s to around 3,000 today. And it's been 20 years now since they were listed under the Endangered Species Act, but their numbers are still declining. So every year at this kooky event called the Razorback Roundup, biologists come from all over and they camp out at Lake Mojave and they all bring, they try to outdo one another with how much food they're gonna cook. They bring smokers and all kinds of, coolers full of beer, and it's like this big party. But what they do is they go around the lake and they collect razorback sucker eggs, and then they deliver them to a hatchery downstream, where they raise them in this hatchery until they're 4 years old, which is when they're big enough that they can survive being eaten by most of these non-native fish. But, there's always a but, there's one non-native fish in the lake, striped bass, which can actually open its mouth wide enough to eat a 4-year-old razorback sucker. And it's impossible to get rid of these striped bass. And one reason is that the striped bass are thriving because there are rainbow trout in the lake, which are a very popular sport fishing fish. If any of you guys fish, you might catch rainbow trout. They're very, very popular. And the striped bass eat the trout, and there's lots of trout, so they're doing great. And then they also eat other things, including the razorback sucker. And the Fish and Wildlife Service actually stocks these rainbow trout in the lake so that people can fish for them. And the money that people pay for fishing licenses goes to pay for conservation, including the Razorback Sucker Conservation Program. And in fact, the Fish and Wildlife Service raises the rainbow trout for sport fishing in the same hatchery, in a pool right next door to where they're raising the razorback suckers. So it's another example, like with the palm oil, of how these opposing forces are so intertwined that you can't just pull them apart. But despite the odds, Paul Marsh, my protagonist, refused to give up on saving these fish. And to me, that was really powerful. So he said, I guess I hope that if we knock on the door long enough, that the door will open and things will move forward in a more meaningful way. I'm also interested in the lengths that people will go to try to save species, while we meanwhile seem unwilling to make basic changes that would arguably be a lot more straightforward. So this is a more recent story, which is coming out next month, about caribou. So caribou are similar to reindeer. They're actually the same species, although they're a different subspecies that's never been domesticated. And in North America, they live across much of Canada and Alaska. We actually used to have a herd here in the continental US, but they were declared extinct earlier this year. Caribou live in old-growth forests, and they reproduce extremely slowly. Caribou cows give birth once every 2 years to just one calf. And they live in these old-growth northern forests. And what's happened over the past 20 or 30 years is that these forests are being increasingly carved up for industrial development, for logging, for mining, for oil and gas extraction. And so their habitat is vanishing. And meanwhile, all the roads that go along with industrial development are opening up these same areas to wolves. So you've got wolves going in where they never were able to get in before, and they're killing the caribou faster than the caribou can reproduce. Caribou are actually listed under Canada's version of our Endangered Species Act, but the provinces there have been very slow to act on any conservation measures. And the reason is because caribou habitat is so valuable economically. So 25% of Canada's GDP actually comes from Alberta's energy industry, which is all on former caribou habitat. I mean, it's still caribou habitat, it's just that they can't actually live there anymore. Western Canada's boreal forests contain roughly a third of the world's proven oil reserves. So this is why no one is willing to say, hey, let's set this massive chunk of land aside and not do any resource extraction there, and we'll just give it to caribou. And instead, they're devising these kind of crazy interventions to try to keep the caribou from vanishing. So I wrote about one effort in northeastern British Columbia to save a single caribou herd. And it involves this very heavy-handed conservation program where they're doing a wolf cull, so they're killing wolves, and then they're also doing something called a maternal pen. So here they are constructing the pen, and what they do basically is every March, by helicopter, they locate the caribou herd, and then they capture the pregnant females. So they have like an aerial gunner in the helicopter who shoots a gun, but instead of a bullet, it's got these nets. So they net the caribou by air, and the caribou gets tangled up in this net, and then this guy jumps out of the helicopter and sedates the caribou and zips it into a body bag, and then they put the body bag in the helicopter and they carry it to this enclosure. And they do this with as many of the pregnant females as they can capture. And then the females give birth in these enclosures. It's not like a cage, it's a big area, but they're penned in, and so they can't get out and predators can't get in. And they give birth there, and then they stay there until the babies are a couple months old and big enough, kind of like the Razorback Sucker, where they can have a fighting chance of survival. It's kind of a crazy thing. And so here, like the other stories, there are champions. The people I wrote about were this husband and wife team of biologists and the chief of a local First Nations tribe who have taken the initiative to try to save this one herd by killing wolves and doing this maternal pen and also doing some habitat restoration. So here they are building the pen. So it has this huge kind of border of this fabric, and then there's also an electric fence around it. It doesn't look like much, but it's actually pretty impenetrable. Here are some cute little caribou pictures, moms and babies in the pen. They have to do a supplemental feeding program because there's not enough, the habitat isn't big enough. There's not enough food in the enclosure to support the population, so they feed them some supplemental food in these troughs. And so there are scientists who have said there's no way that we can save all the caribou. And the only option is triage. And what we need to do is choose some herds, maybe like this one that I wrote about, to save and just let the others slip away. And here's what one of them, a really terrific biologist at the University of Montana, wrote recently. He said, pretending we can continue to conserve everything and asking wolves to pay the price while energy development continues is not only ethically and morally wrong, it is extremely poor conservation policy. And he may be right. So as you can see, writing about the environment can be pretty depressing. Friends always ask me, what are you working on? And I'm like, I don't know, should I spoil their day by telling them? But I tried to find ways to keep myself going. And one way, like I said, is to focus on the champions. And another is to write stories that are compelling on more of a philosophical level. And one of my favorite of those is another story that won a AAAS Kavli award. And strangely, it's also about a fish, which is purely a coincidence, I think. So this story ran in Wired a few years ago, and it asked the question, what exactly are we trying to preserve when we do conservation? I did not write that headline, but I like it. So to answer this question, I traveled to the Nevada desert to see the barbed wire fenced home of the extremely endangered devil's hole pupfish. So it's a tiny, tiny silvery blue fish, like this big. And it lives in just one warm aquifer in the Mojave Desert, which is the bottom there. And last I checked, there were about 50 of these fish left. So once these pupfish lived in a sprawling lake, which used to be there, in what's now the Mojave. But about 20,000 years ago, water levels dropped, and the area turned to desert, and these fish were basically isolated from each other in a series of separate ponds. And over time, they evolved into 9 different species. And several of them are endangered now, but the devil's hole pupfish are definitely the worst off. The aquifer they live in is part of Death Valley National Park. So this is what you see when you go to find them. They're under the jurisdiction of the National Park Service, which for years has been trying to save them by round-the-clock environmental monitoring and a supplemental feeding program. So when you go, you can basically see them, like you can go on this overlook, which is all fenced, and see them. This is a Park Service biologist unlocking the multiple locks so that we could go down there. It's actually under lock and key, partly to prevent people from throwing stuff down into the aquifer, which has actually happened in the past. So that's why they had to like fence in. This is sort of a bridge, and they had to put fencing over the whole thing so that nobody could chuck stuff over it into the pool. So one biologist believes that the problem has nothing to do with their environment or with food, but actually with the fish's own DNA. And he believes that the fish in the pool have become so inbred that they're actually in what he calls an extinction vortex. So this is my protagonist, Andy Martin, who's a biologist and a geneticist at the University of Colorado. And those are so that's the aquifer. That's kind of the top of it. It's very, very deep, and it runs under these rocks, but that's kind of all you can see of it. And they have these supplemental feeding things and all kinds of monitoring equipment to monitor like the dissolved oxygen and all kinds of other things in there. So back in the 1970s, government scientists built 3 artificial pools as a kind of hedge against calamity. So they thought, you know, if something happens in this aquifer and all the fish die, we want to have a backup population. So they built these 3 artificial pools nearby. And in 2 of the pools, actually disaster struck in the artificial pools. Lightning struck a transformer. There were all kinds of mechanical problems with valves and pumps. And in 2 of the pools, all the fish died. But in one pool, something really interesting happened. A few pupfish from a different species that lived nearby somehow infiltrated the pool. They think it was from a nearby stream that they got in through a filter. And their genes quickly spread through the whole population, and they could tell this because there were kind of telltale signs. I think they have an extra fin or something. And after a few years, every single fish in this pool was descended from these few invaders. And so wildlife officials took all these fish out of this artificial pool, and they sent them to a hatchery. They put them in a tank in a hatchery, where unlike the devil's hole pupfish, these fish could not stop reproducing. They just went crazy. The devil's hole pupfish won't really breed in captivity, but these fish went crazy. And so to Andy Martin, the scientist I wrote about, this showed the problem. The fish in the aquifer were suffering from what he calls a mutational meltdown. They basically have too many faulty genes that have built up in their inbred population. And it also pointed to a solution. What he proposed is that we drop a couple of fish from a closely related pupfish species into Devil's Hole and let them revive the population. So this is, I'm not sure if this is the exact fish, but this is one of the related fish. And so you would save the Devil's Hole pupfish by essentially rewriting its genome. You would essentially be saving a species by fundamentally changing it. Now, you may or may not care about pupfish, and I am fairly certain that most Wired readers could not care less about pupfish, but Martin's idea represents a philosophical shift in how we think about our relationship to nature. The traditional approach to conservation was protect this species as it exists right here, right now, right? So we fence off this swath of wilderness and step aside. But in this new order, we'd be the stewards, not just of land or wildlife, but of DNA. So I think I'll leave it there with just one final thought. These are those headlines again, not to depress you further, but just to make a point. We are in a state of emergency, and it is our job, my job, and your jobs to tell these stories. And telling them is really hard, but we can't give up. I can't give up. This is my little guy. As a science journalist friend of mine wrote to me in an email the other day, I'll just read this. We have to keep offering information and science translation because that's what we do. We won't be as good at anything else, and someday, if not now, it will perhaps be helpful. If we stop and the machinery gets rusty, we won't be poised for more hopeful times. Thank you.
So now we are going to open it up for questions. We'd like to do it into the mic because we have a Facebook Live audience with us, which I apologize for not acknowledging on the front end, but the way they can hear us is if we all use a mic. So who has the first question?
Okay. Hi, I'm Lauren Robinson. I'm a graduate journalism student studying science reporting. I was just curious how you fund these trips abroad as you're a freelance journalist.
Sure, yeah. So I'm just trying to think. All of these stories were paid for by the publications themselves. And so there are actually still a lot of publications that will pay for travel. The Razorback Sucker story, well, that was actually a fairly cheap story because I live in Colorado and it was in Nevada. But they're a nonprofit, but they actually have a reporting fund. So they kind of like raise a separate pool of money to fund some stories that might be more expensive. So all the other publications funded the travel themselves, but there are tons of travel grants that you can apply for. There's the Pulitzer Center for Crisis Reporting has money for trips like this. There's FERN, which is the Food and Environment Reporting Network. I'm sure there are more that I'm forgetting about. There are some pretty creative ways. The SEJ, the Society of Environmental Journalists, has reporting grants. And so sometimes you can kind of partner up. I've also done stories where I've gone to one place and then already been there and asked the editor beforehand, is it okay to do something else while I'm here? And then kind of piggybacked off that to do some other trips for other places. So like you're already in, Indonesia or whatever, and then you can kind of, it's much cheaper to maybe get somewhere else in Southeast Asia.
Hello, my name is Alexa Shanes. I'm also a graduate student studying science journalism. I'm curious how you develop sources, especially locals, in places abroad that you've never visited before.
So nonprofits are always a really good way to go. For the palm oil story, that was definitely challenging, and I spent a lot of time trying to set up those trips. I would say If I had to think about the hourly rate that I made for that story, it would be quite upsetting. Partly just because of those logistics. There were a lot of late night Skype conversations and stuff. But I started out with, I tend to start with scientists because, you know, I do science journalism, so that's always my first inclination. But so I called up some researchers that I knew worked in forests in Sabah. And then I would say to them, this is what I'm looking for, can you connect me with people? And in a couple of cases, they connected me with nonprofits that were working on the ground. And so then it was just like, it's just a lot of kind of email and, you know, I was really looking, I had no idea where to go to report that story. I mean, I knew I wanted to tell a particular story in Sabah because they are actually, as a state, trying to certify their entire palm oil supply. And so I knew I wanted to go there, but I was like, what do I do when I get off the plane? And who do I talk to? And how do I find these people? And so there were a lot of local nonprofits that had people on the ground there. And you can kind of start with, sometimes you can start with a bigger organization. So like WWF, for instance, has conservation programs all around the world. So they will have people on the ground, and then you can ask them for like more kind of local NGOs, and then you can sort of meet people that way. The smallholder farmers that I interviewed, I went through another nonprofit, a local nonprofit that was specifically working with smallholder farmers, and so they took me around to like meet some of these people and talk to them.
Hi, Hillary. Thanks for coming to be with us today. My name's Jillian. I'm also an MSJ student, the Health, Environment, and Science program. So as far as your sources for stories, like the champions that you were talking about, once you do find them, how much time do you spend with them when you tell these stories? And then how much time do you spend out in the field doing the research? And then what's the time frame look like when you're turning the story around?
So it really varies depending on the publication. That palm oil story was assigned to me back in 2015. January 2015 it was assigned, and it's running in December 2018. Each of the places that I went for 2 weeks, but that's National Geographic, and they're a little bit of a different beast. The Razorback Sucker story, I think I was probably in the field for like 4 or 5 days. Probably same with the Pupfish story. The Caribou story was actually shorter than that. It was like 3 days. So it really depends. And sometimes, like with the Pupfish story, you know, Andy Martin, the biologist, so I went in the field with him, but then he also is based in Boulder, which is where I'm based. So I spent more time with him. Then I visited him in his office, and then I had multiple conversations with him, and I could kind of go back to him. So it's kind of nice to have like a local source that you can go back to. So, you know, some of these stories are a much more condensed timeline. The Caribou story I reported in July, and it's running later this month, I think, in the Atlantic. But it really does depend on how much. It also depends on what the situation is. So like the Razorback Sucker story, like I went to cover a specific event, which was this Razorback Roundup, and so, you know, I spent time with these scientists during that event, and I got enough so that I didn't really need to see them afterwards, but there were some follow-up conversations.
All right, hi, I'm Evan Robinson Johnson. I'm a freshman journalism student here at Medill. My question is, you've traveled really all over the world for a lot of your science reporting, but how has your location in Boulder, Colorado, and with Rocky Mountain National Park in your backyard, how has that really inspired a lot of your work? Or any of your work, I guess.
Yeah, no, I do. I mean, I have done a lot of reporting in Colorado and around the West. So I actually wrote a column for about a year in a monthly magazine in Denver called 5280. I wrote an environment column. I mean, the nice thing about where I live is that there are so many environmental stories all around. I mean, that's true everywhere, but it seems like particularly true in Colorado. And there are also a lot of amazing sources all around. So there's like all these government labs in Boulder. There's a university. There's just like this incredible resource of scientists to kind of tap into. So it's probably, it's really, Boulder's a really great place to live for access to scientists. But I think it's also, there are just so many natural resource stories in the West that it's been great for that also.
My name's Eddie. I'm also a first-year student here. My question, why is it important for people like us to be writing about this, or should we be changing tack completely and like trying to be more of the champions, if that makes sense?
That's a great question. I guess it's really which one you feel more passionately about, or which one seems like what you want to do. I mean, I'm not an activist, and I don't have the sort of disposition to be an activist, nor do I have the disposition to be a scientist, and I discovered that very early on. There's a geologist sitting right here in the red shirt who I was fortunate enough to go do field work with during my graduate program. We went to Iceland, and I mean, like, it was just hours and hours in the freezing cold with these bugs flying around you, and you're wearing this like mesh net, and you're like hungry and cold. And at the end of the day, I'm like, oh great, time to go get a beer. Can we be done now? And I'm gonna file my story. And she's like, oh no, we're doing this again tomorrow, and the day after that, and the day after that. And so like it was very clear to me that I do not have the discipline or attention span to be a scientist. And so to me, being a journalist is great because I kind of get to like dive in and out of these things. I get to do this deep dive and learn all about it and go out in the field, and then I can kind of explain it to people, and then I can write about something else. So it's really all about what kind of calls to you, I guess. I think they're all equally important.
Hi, my name is Brady. I'm also a graduate student here. And I'm actually from Boulder, so I'm feeling very nostalgic right now. My question, we read your op-ed on healthcare in that opinion piece, and I'm wondering if you can talk about the balance between writing about science and environment, and how opinionated should science writers be, and should we be more opinionated maybe than other journalists?
Yeah, I feel like this is like a whole, I could do like a whole separate talk on this. So the op-ed that he's talking about was a first-person piece that I wrote in the New York Times about trying to get healthcare as a freelancer through the Affordable Care Act. And that was probably much more of a personal thing than I normally write. But I do, there's a lot of talk about the view from nowhere. Have you guys heard this term? There's always been this idea that newsrooms, newspapers in particular, need to be objective, right? Like the story should be this view from nowhere. The problem with that is that it creates this kind of false balance. So you don't see this so much anymore, but when I first started writing about climate change, there was still this, even in the New York Times, it was like, oh, we're gonna say something about climate change, but then we have to have this disclaimer that says that like, some people don't believe that climate change is real. And as the scientific consensus kind of grew and grew and grew until it was, nearly unanimous that climate change is happening and humans are causing it, what they did instead was they would say something about climate change, and then they would quote like a politician or someone who didn't believe that climate change was happening. And somehow that was like balanced. But what it does is it actually gives credence to ideas that are not really worth giving credence to. And so, I'm asked a lot, like, how do you deal with, are you an advocate? And how do you deal with this? I write mostly for magazines, and magazine stories are sort of expected to have a point of view, so I'm fortunate in that. But my personal position is that I believe that everybody has a right to clean air and clean water, and that other species actually have a right to exist on this planet, and that it is we really need to protect the planet for future generations. And I believe those things firmly. And so that is the position that I'm writing from. And I don't think that makes me an advocate. I don't know. I don't think that makes me an advocate, but I definitely do have a point of view, and that's what it is. And I think it's perfectly fine to have that point of view when you're writing for a magazine. You can't really have that much of a subjective point of view when you're writing for something like a newspaper, but I do also think that there's no reason that you have to be like framing something as balanced and like giving, you know, both sides credence if one side is scientifically founded and the other side isn't.
Hello, my name is TJ Kim. I'm a freshman at Medill. I'm not trying to sound pessimistic here, but when you write environmental stories, do you ever see an end to this environmental crisis, or do you see it's an unsolvable, ongoing issue?
Honestly, it depends on the day. Last week, I felt pretty pessimistic when I saw all those headlines. But I think that, I mean, there have been really bad things that have happened on this planet before for millennia, and we've often managed to find a way out of them, and humans have managed to solve a lot of things, you know, diseases and all kinds of things. So I think it is definitely possible. Like, there's no reason why we can't solve these things and make things right. It's just a question of kind of political will and personal will. And so I guess to a certain degree, that depends on you.
I have one here and then.
Hi, my name is Miranda Chabot. I'm also a freshman here at Medill. And I was just wondering, I feel like a lot of science journalism kind of focuses on possible solutions to the problems we see in the world. Do you think that it's more important to focus on like systematic change in the government, or would you rather write about like grassroots individual change?
I mean, I think it's hard to write a feature story about systematic change in the government because it doesn't really lend itself to good narrative, unfortunately. So it tends to be a lot easier to write about, you know, the one individual and what they're doing. But I kind of think we need it all. I mean, that's sort of what that op-ed was talking about that I mentioned early on. You know, there is this kind of huge ship that needs to be turned around. And so I think all kinds of reporting is necessary. And I think, you know, political reporting too, like investigative reporting. There's this great investigative reporter at the New York Times who I saw speak last week, Eric Lipton. And he does all this incredible data-driven journalism about you know, money and power and the influence of lobbyists on policy. And that stuff is so valuable. Like, it shows you, you know, he does all these freedom of information requests and like does all this database research to show like, oh, well, you know, this guy who just took over the EPA division that handles energy came in with like he basically got a letter from the American Petroleum Institute and came in and implemented their exact agenda. And he can prove that like with a paper trail. And that kind of stuff is incredibly important. I don't do that. I sort of like to do this more kind of character-driven, narrative-driven, more like explanatory writing, but I think it's all important.
Hi, I'm Carolyn Wilkie. I'm a PhD student and also a science writer, and I was wondering if you could share how you find these really interesting and compelling environmental stories, or maybe the stories find you.
Yeah, so it's definitely a little bit of both. Some of how I find them is when scientists like you come to me and say, hey, I'm working on this thing and I thought you might be interested in it. So I go to a lot of scientific conferences and I just go to talks and meet people. Sometimes if there's a topic that I know I'm interested in, I will seek out researchers who are working on that topic and try to see if there's a story in any of it. Often I find stories hidden in other stories, either other people's stories or my own. So like I'll be reading a story on something and there's just like one little throwaway line that's not really followed up on. And so I'll take that and follow up on it. I get a lot of my story ideas while working on other stories. But the main thing is that, I mean, the main way I get stories does not involve sitting at my desk and using Google. the main way that I find stories is by going out and talking to people in the world.
Hi, I'm Stephanie. I'm a graduate student. So you were saying that some of your stories can take years to come to fruition, and I was just wondering if you ever run into a time where you found out after working on something for like a year that someone was doing it also, and then they beat you to it.
Yeah, I mean, that happened with this Caribou story, in fact. I emailed, so I reported this story in July, and about a month ago or 6 weeks ago, I emailed the scientist a follow-up question, and he responded, and he was like, oh, by the way, did you see the story that came out last week? And I went to the link, and it was my story. I mean, it was a story by a scientist, by a journalist who had gone to the same place that I did with this same guy who had not mentioned it to me. And in fact, I know this journalist not well, but I had met her after she had been there. And I had told her, hey, I just came from this place. And she did not say, oh, I was there last week. And I saw this story and my heart sank into my stomach. And I immediately emailed my editor and said, what do you want to do about this? And she didn't care at all. She felt like what we were going to do was going to be sufficiently different enough, or my voice would make it different enough, or she just didn't seem to be bothered by it. But sometimes people are. I remember I did a story 10 years ago for Popular Science. It was one of the first stories where it might have been the first story where I traveled overseas. And I went to Ethiopia to write this story, which was kind of a big deal for me. It was my first trip to Africa, I think. And I came home and I transcribed all my notes, but I had a family vacation planned. And so I said to my editor, is it okay if I turn this in after my vacation? Bad idea. And I went on vacation and I came back, and I think we went on a camping trip. We actually came back through Missoula, Montana, and stopped at a friend's house for a couple days. And while I was there, I went on the internet to check my email or whatever, and saw this story in the New Yorker, of all places, about this same guy, who again had not told me oh, hey, this other journalist was just, he hadn't gone to Ethiopia, but he had gone to somewhere else with this same source and written a story about the same thing. And I was just crushed. And I called my editor thinking he was going to say oh, we're going to kill the story. But he was really supportive, and what he did was encourage me to kind of try to find a different way in and sort of frame the story differently. And that was actually a really instructive lesson on how many different ways there are to tell a story, because I actually think, even though I'd already done the reporting, so it wasn't like I could do something fundamentally different, but I sort of reframed it and talked to some different people, and I actually think the story I did was better than it would have been otherwise. So it does happen. I mean, there are a lot of reporters out there, and there's some stories that are just so good that people are going to jump on them. But I think there's often ways to fix it.
Hi, I'm Maddie. I'm a graduate student here in the science reporting as well. I was wondering, when you're covering a story that's maybe really science heavy, how do you include all the really necessary information without having the story get bogged down in really specific science?
Yeah, I mean, I deal with this all the time. And so there's actually a big part of the Pupfish story, which I didn't go into here, but it's about what really is a species, and were the devil's hole pupfish actually a unique species, or were the measures by which people used to kind of define a new species, are they out of date? And so one thing that this scientist, Andy Martin, believes is that the devil's hole pupfish are actually just a subspecies. And so it's not that big a deal to kind of make a hybrid with this other subspecies. But lots of other people think differently. And so I had this whole section in my story about what makes a species and how do we actually define what a species is and does it matter. And I think you just have to, what I tend to do is kind of weave back and forth between the on-the-ground narrative and the kind of science part of it. I find, because I write about the same kind of issues a lot, I tend to write a lot about conservation biology and ecology. And so, as happens with a lot of scientists, like you get kind of bogged down in this jargon. Like you don't even realize that you're using jargon, but because I know what these terms mean and I'm used to hearing scientists use them, I end up, putting them in my writing without meaning to. And so what I always do is have either my husband or a friend kind of read a draft before I turn it in. I've gotten better at sort of noticing it now, but I like to send it to someone who knows nothing about the subject so that they can be like, I have no idea what you're talking about. Because I think you really want to stop, the important stuff with the complex science is to make it accessible and try to find ways to explain it using metaphors that someone without a science background can understand. And that's where I think, that's what makes a science story come to life, I think, as much as the characters and the narrative.
Other question? I have a question about your degrees. You have an MFA, right? And
Yes.
a environmental policy
Yes.
degree.
Yeah.
And you're a journalist, so you're not writing fiction.
Right.
And you're not practicing science.
Right.
How do those two degrees inform what you do, and how necessary do you think they were to becoming a science journalist?
So it's funny because people ask me about the MFA. I sometimes forget that I have that degree. But I do think, sometimes I feel like it was a waste of time. But I actually do think that it taught me something about storytelling and kind of how to tell a story, the value of strong characters, tension, all these things. I do think there's something about fiction that I try to, think about when I'm writing. So I like to think that that one helped me in some small way. But that was from right after college when I thought maybe I'm gonna be a great novelist. It's not gonna happen. The MS in Environmental Studies informs my work pretty much every story that I write. So for me, because I did not have any science background, and I saw all these stories being written that even, I just could tell that the reporters writing them didn't really fully understand what they were writing. They were sort of regurgitating what people were telling them. And I did not want to do that. And so I consciously went back to school to avoid doing that. Partly also I was really intimidated by the idea of interviewing scientists because I just felt like they're gonna know that I don't know anything and I'm not gonna know how to talk to them or how to ask the right questions. So that degree just gave me a tremendous amount of confidence. But really more it was, just trying to have enough of a level of knowledge that I could sort of know when things don't quite sound right or when they are. So.
Any other questions?
Thank you all.
Thank you.